The river moved quietly that night, as though it wished not to be seen. Smoke from the mills hung low over the water, thick and metallic, settling over the town like a warning no one could quite name. Behind locked gates and barbed wire, furnaces slept. Outside, men waited in silence, their breaths shallow in the dark. They had built those furnaces with their hands. They had fed them with sweat, with burned skin, with broken backs. And now, someone else had come to claim them. Just before dawn, a shape appeared on the Monongahela River, long, low, and deliberate. Then another behind it, barges drifting without lanterns, carrying hundreds of armed men, not soldiers of the United States, but hired guards. In Homestead, Pennsylvania, July 1892, the steelwork stood like a fortress. A 12-foot fence crowned with barbed wire surrounded the mill. Fort Frick, the workers called it, half in bitterness, half in disbelief. The gates had been locked days earlier. Wages cut. Contracts dismissed. Dignity questioned. By sunrise, gunfire would echo across the riverbanks. Men wooed fall workers and guards alike. And far away, in a quiet Scottish castle, the man whose fortune towered over it all would read telegrams by candlelight. He had once written, "The man who dies, thus rich, dies disgraced." But on that morning, wealth was not the question. Power was, and the cost of power was about to be measured in blood. Welcome to Dynasty Estates Chronicles, where we uncover the gripping stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry that shaped the world's most powerful families and fortunes. From gilded mansions to factory floors, from whispered boardroom deals to public clashes that changed nations, we explore the triumphs and the hidden costs beyond. Old money empires. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter in history's grandest dynasties. Andrew Carnegie was not born into wealth, nor into comfort. He was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, in a small stone house where the wind crept through cracks in the walls and the sound of handlooms filled the air. His father, William Carnegie, was a handloom weaver. Skilled, proud, and increasingly desperate. The Industrial Revolution, which would later make his son a titan, was already destroying men like him. Machines were replacing craftsmen. The old ways were dying, and with them, dignity. The Carnegie family lived modestly, but they were not without ideals. William had been involved in the Chartist movement, which demanded voting rights for working men. At the kitchen table, young Andrew heard talk of fairness, representation, and the injustice of concentrated power. Those ideas would never fully leave him, though later he would interpret them in his own way. But principles do not fill an empty stomach. By the mid-1840s, famine and economic collapse tightened their grip on Scotland. William's weaving business failed. The family pawned possessions. Neighbors left for America. In 1848, when Andrew was 13, the Carnegies did the same. They boarded a ship bound for Pennsylvania, carrying little more than hope and a few borrowed pounds. In Allegheny, the reality of America struck quickly. There were no estates waiting. No grand welcomes, only smoke, factories, and the harsh arithmetic of survival. Andrew became a bobbin boy in a textile mill, earning $1.20 a week. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. He later recalled the humiliation of that first wage. I resolved that I would cure that poverty. There is a Scottish proverb that says, "A hungry belly has no ears." Carnegie listened carefully. He observed everything. He memorized telegraph signals. He practiced writing at night. He borrowed books from a local benefactor, Colonel James Anderson, who opened his private library to working boys every Saturday. Those books became Andrew's first glimpse of another life. Years later, Carnegie would say, "There is no class so pitiably wretched as that which possesses money and nothing else." But at 13, money meant survival. Money meant never again watching his father fail. By 14, he had secured a position as a telegraph messenger. He ran messages through the streets of Pittsburgh, learning names, networks, and power structures. He memorized routes and faces. Soon, he taught himself to interpret telegraph signals by ear, an impressive skill at the time. It earned him a promotion. At 80, he was noticed by Thomas A. Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott became his mentor. Under him, Carnegie learned the inner workings of corporate power organization, efficiency, loyalty to superiors, and the importance of strategic investment. The boy who once feared hunger now began to understand something greater. Industry was the future, and those who mastered it would rule not only markets, but society. But buried beneath ambition was something quieter, a vow made in poverty. A would rise. He would never be powerless again. And in that promise, both greatness and conflict were already taking shape. By the time Andrew Carnegie entered his 20s, he had already learned a lesson that would guide the rest of his life. Opportunity rarely announces itself politely. It arrives disguised as risk. Under the mentorship of Thomas A. Scott at the Pennsylvania Railroad, Carnegie witnessed the arteries of American commerce. They were instruments of empire. During the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, Carnegie served as Scott's assistant in military railway operations. War, for many, meant death. For industry, it meant contracts. Carnegie invested in sleeping cars, iron bridges, and oil. Each investment was calculated, not reckless. He once remarked, "Put all your eggs in one basket, and then watch that basket." It was not recklessness he preached, but focus. The Keystone Bridge Company became one of his first major ventures. Wooden bridges were failing under the weight of heavier trains. Iron was stronger, more reliable, and modern. Carnegie recognized that infrastructure was the spine of progress. He understood that steel stronger than iron, more durable, more efficient, would soon replace it altogether. But foresight alone does not create fortune. Timing does. In 1873, America plunged into financial panic. Banks collapsed, railroads failed, markets trembled, many businessmen retreated in fear. Carnegie did the opposite. He bought cheaply, ruthlessly. There is an old saying, "When there is blood in the streets, buy property." He believed downturns were temporary, but assets acquired during them were permanent. He traveled to Britain and studied the Bessemer steel process, a revolutionary method that allowed steel to be produced more quickly and cheaply. Convinced that the material would shape the future of bridges, railways, ships, and cities. By 1875, he opened the Edgar Thomson Steel Works near Pittsburgh, named after a railroad executive who had supported him. The plant was modern, efficient, and relentless in its output. Sentiment had no place in ledgers. "Watch the costs, and the profits will take care of themselves," he famously advised. Yet beneath that discipline lay something sterner. Carnegie believed inefficiency was a moral failure. He viewed industry almost as a Darwinian arena, survival of the fittest. Competition was not cruel in his mind. It was natural. The strong prevailed. The weak adapted or vanished. And yet, he was not blind to suffering. He remembered the bobbin mill. He remembered his father's failure. That memory did not soften him. It hardened him. He saw wealth as protection. As armor. He began structuring his business around vertical integration, controlling not only steel mills but also the raw materials, transport, and distribution, iron mines, coal fields, rail connections. Each acquisition tightened his grip. Each decision reduced dependence on others. A proverb from the era captured the mood. He who controls the iron controls the rail. He who controls the rail controls the nation. Carnegie intended control both. By the mid-1870s, his wealth was growing rapidly. Recognition followed. Investors respected him. Industrialists watched him. He was no longer the immigrant boy, chasing wages. He was shaping the skeleton of America's future. But every strategy carries a shadow. Efficiency required lower costs. Lower costs meant pressure. Pressure traveled downward onto managers and then onto workers. Hours were long. Conditions harsh. Wages were tightly measured against productivity. Carnegie convinced himself that this was temporary hardship in service of permanent progress. In his mind, industry was civilization itself. The man who dies, rich dies, disgraced, he would later write. But first, one had to become rich. And to become rich in steel meant mastering fire. He had made his first fortune by understanding crisis and seizing opportunity. The question that lingered, though unspoken, was this: when crisis came again, not in markets, but among men wood, he seized that with the same cold clarity. The Edgar Thomson Steel Works did not merely produce steel, it produced momentum. From the moment the first rails rolled out in 1875, Andrew Carnegie's enterprise moved with the rhythm of the furnaces. Constant, roaring, unforgiving, demand for steel grew as America stretched westward. Railways crossed plains. Cities rose upward. Bridges leaped across rivers once thought impassable. Steel was no longer a material. It was the language of modernity, and Carnegie had learned to speak it fluently. He believed deeply in what he called the law of competition. In his view, rivalry sharpened industry, the way fire tempered metal. It is a law of nature, Aeon Sergade, that the strong shall survive. To him, consolidation was not greed. It was progress. Inefficient mills closed. Outdated systems vanished. The future belonged to those willing to embrace relentless improvement. But improvement had a cost. Carnegie refined his strategy of vertical integration until it became almost surgical. He acquired iron ore fields in Minnesota's Mesabi Range. He secured coke supplies through partnerships with men like Henry Clay Frick, whose operations in the Connellsville coal fields produced the fuel that powered Carnegie's furnaces. He controlled rail transport. He negotiated favorable shipping contracts. Every stage of production was folded inward, under one expanding authority. There is a proverb often repeated in industry: control the source, and you control the outcome. Carnegie embraced it fully. He reduced reliance on middlemen and tightened efficiency at every turn. The result was staggering. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel was the largest and most profitable steel company in the United States. Pittsburgh became known as the Steel City. Smoke hung permanently in the sky. At night, the mills glowed like molten suns. Visitors described the scene as both magnificent and infernal, beauty wrapped in brutality. Workers labored 12 hours a day, sometimes more. Shifts rotated weekly between day and night. Injuries were common. Accidents were accepted as the price of output. Yet Carnegie rarely saw the injuries directly. As his wealth expanded, so did his social standing. He traveled frequently between America and Britain. He purchased Skybow Castle in Scotland, transforming it into a grand estate. He dined with politicians, intellectuals, and writers. He corresponded with British Prime Minister William Gladstone. He entered elite society not as a curiosity, but as an equal. To some, he represented the triumph of the self-made man, the embodiment of the American dream. To others, he symbolized the growing chasm between capital and labor. In 1889, Carnegie published an essay that would define his public image: The Gospel of Wealth. In it, he argued that vast fortunes were not only acceptable, but beneficial if used responsibly. The man who dies, thus rich, dies disgraced, he declared. Wealth, he insisted, should be administered by its possessor for the good of the community. The millionaire was not to hoard riches, but to distribute them wisely. It was a bold vision. Libraries, schools, cultural institutions. He believed philanthropy could elevate the mass. Education, he felt, was the ladder he himself had climbed. But here lay the contradiction. While he advocated generosity in theory, his business practices demanded discipline without sentiment. Wage reductions were justified as market necessities. Union demands were treated as inefficiencies. Carnegie publicly expressed mild sympathy toward organized labor, even writing that workers had the right to combine for mutual protection. Privately, however, he insisted that management must retain ultimate authority. A saying from the ERA captured the tension. Capital may talk kindly, but it counts strictly. In boardrooms, numbers mattered more than ideals. His partnership with Henry Clay Frick deepened during this period. Frick was stern, unyielding, and openly hostile toward unions. Where Carnegie preferred persuasion, Frick preferred confrontation. Yet Carnegie valued Frick's toughness. Steel, after all, was forged under pressure. By 1890, Carnegie Steel dominated the market. Profits soared. Competitors struggled to keep pace. The company's efficiency allowed it to lower prices and still maintain margins others could not match. It was said that no steel rail in America was laid without passing, in some form, through Carnegie's influence. The expansion of power brought not only wealth, but insulation. Carnegie no longer stood in factories listening to the clang of machinery. He stood at a distance, geographically and emotionally. Managers oversaw day-to-day operations, partners enforced discipline. Decisions flowed downward. Meanwhile, the workforce grew restless. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had gained strength in several mills, including Homestead. Skilled workers believed they deserved recognition and stability. They viewed themselves not as replaceable cogs, but as craftsmen. Pride in labor ran deep. Carnegie, at least publicly, maintained that harmonious relations between labor and capital were possible. There's little difference between the employer and the employed, he wrote, when both understand that their interests are mutual. Yet interests are rarely identical when profits rise and wages tighten. The more Carnegie consolidated control, the more vulnerable workers felt. The mills became models of efficiency and of surveillance. Costs were measured daily. Productivity charts tracked output. Managers were instructed to eliminate waste. In such an environment, even human beings could appear as figures in a ledger. Still, Carnegie believed sincerely in his mission. He saw himself as a steward of progress. He funded cultural projects. He envisioned a world improved by disciplined capitalism and enlightened giving. But history has a way of testing ideals. A proverb warns, the higher the tower, the longer the shadow. By 1890, Carnegie's tower was immense. His shadow stretched across an industry and across thousands of working families. He had risen from poverty to power with discipline, intelligence, and daring. He had mastered markets, embraced innovation, and shaped a nation's infrastructure. Yet within that rise lay a fault line, a quiet tension between philanthropy and profit, between theory and practice. The furnaces burned hotter each year. And in one mill town, along the Monongahela River, the heat was building toward something neither steel nor sermons could contain. Long before gunfire echoed across the Monongahela, there were smaller sounds, murmurs in break rooms, whispers beside furnaces, quiet calculations made in kitchen lamplight. The Homestead Steelworks had been one of Carnegie's prized operations. Skilled workers there belonged largely to the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest craft unions in the country. These were not untrained laborers. They were men who understood the temper of molten metal, who judged heat by color, who knew that a single miscalculation could cost a limb or a life. They believed their skill entitled them to respect. In 1889, after tense negotiations, the union secured a favorable contract. Wages were tied to the market price of steel, and workers gained a measure of security. For a brief moment, it seemed proof that capital and labor might coexist without violence. Carnegie himself had written that labor unions were not necessarily harmful if managed wisely. Publicly, he appeared progressive compared to other industrial magnates. But markets shift as swiftly as furnaces flare. By 1891, steel prices began to decline. Profits tightened. Efficiency, once again, became the governing principle. Carnegie retreated to Scotland for extended stays, leaving operational authority increasingly in the hands of his chairman, Henry Clay Frick. If Carnegie believed in persuasion, Frick believed in discipline. Frick viewed unions as obstacles to efficiency, as unnecessary centers of power within his mills. "We will not recognize the union," he declared privately to associates. To him, management authority was absolute. There could not be two masters in one factory. The contract at Homestead was due to expire in June 1892. Negotiations began in 1891. Frick proposed significant wage reductions, particularly for the highest-paid skilled workers. The union resisted. They argued that productivity had risen, profits had been strong. Why should labor alone bear the burden of market fluctuations? A saying common among workers at the time captured their mood. When times are good, profits are private. When times are bad, losses are shared. Tension thickened. Ladders were exchanged. Meetings stretched late into the night. Carnegie, in correspondence from Scotland, advised Frick to stand firm but to avoid unnecessary provocation. His language was measured, almost philosophical, yet he did not forbid confrontation, and sometimes silence speaks louder than instruction. Frick prepared. Quietly, plans were drafted to operate the mill without union labor if necessary. Replacement workers were considered. Security measures were discussed. What had once been negotiation began to resemble preparation for siege. The workers sensed it. At Homestead, fences were reinforced. Rumors spread that management intended to break the union entirely. Trust eroded. Men who had once believed Carnegie sympathetic began to question whether he had ever truly stood with them. The rivalry was no longer abstract. It was no longer a debate in pamphlets or essays. It was becoming personal, about pride, livelihood, and identity. For the workers, the mill was not merely employment. It was survival. For Frick, it was authority. For Carnegie, it was legacy. And as another proverb warns, two swords cannot rest in one sheath. The first clash had not yet erupted into violence, but the blade had already been drawn. By early 1892, negotiation had given way to calculation. Henry Clay Frick was not a man who relied on optimism. He believed in preparation. If the union intended to resist wage reductions, he would be ready to resist their resistance. In February, formal proposals were presented. Sliding wage scales would be altered, and many skilled workers would see reductions. The Amalgamated Association refused to accept the terms. What followed was not an explosion, but a tightening. Frick announced that if no agreement were reached by the contract's expiration in late June, the company would no longer deal with the union. Management would negotiate only with individual workers. To the union, this was not compromise. It was eradication. Behind the scenes, Frick ordered the construction of a formidable wooden fence around the Homestead plant. 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, equipped with watchtowers and loopholes for rifles. Workers soon gave it a bitter name. For Frick, a factory had become a fortress. There is an old proverb: when you build a wall, you must expect someone to test its strength. The wall at Homestead was not merely physical. It was symbolic. It announced that trust had ended. On the 29th of June 1892, before the existing contract expired, Frick locked the workers out. Notices were posted declaring that the plant would operate as a non-union facility. Workers gathered outside the gates in disbelief. Some had given decades of their lives to those furnaces. Now they were excluded from them as though they were strangers. Meanwhile, Andrew Carnegie remained at Skibo Castle in Scotland. From there, telegrams crossed the Atlantic. He advised firmness. He expressed hope that matters would resolve peacefully. Yet he did not instruct Frick to retreat. Later, critics would question whether distance absolved responsibility. At the time, his absence created ambiguity. Workers wondered, did Carnegie approve? Did he know the full extent of Frick's preparations? Silence filled the gaps. Frick anticipated that the locked-out workers might attempt to retake the plant. To prevent this, he arranged for the hiring of 300 Pinkerton detectives, private security agents, with a reputation for they were to be transported by river under cover of darkness and installed within the mill to secure it for non-union labor. To the workers, this was provocation. Meetings were held in town halls and taverns. Men organized patrols along the river. They established a committee to monitor developments. The atmosphere shifted from protests to vigilance. A phrase circulated among labor activists of the era: an injury to one is an injury to all. Though Homestead was one mill among many, workers across the nation watched closely. If the union were crushed there, what protection remained elsewhere? Frick believed time was on his side. He assumed hunger and financial pressure would weaken resolve. The company controlled the property. The state, if necessary, would side with order. But emotion rarely obeys arithmetic. Resentment deepened into anger. Anger into defiance. The fence loomed over the river bank like a challenge. Children stared at it. Wives discussed it in whispers. Skilled men who had taken pride in their craft now felt reduced to obstacles, and beneath it all lay a deeper wound: betrayal. Carnegie had spoken of harmony between labor and capital. He had praised unions in principle. Now, in practice, the union at Homestead faced extinction. As another saying warns, the bitterest quarrels arise between those who once trusted. By late June, both sides believed they were defending something fundamental: authority on one side, dignity on the other. The mill stood silent. The river flowed past its locked gates, and in that silence, the rivalry hardened into inevitability. By the summer of 1892, the conflict at Homestead had grown beyond a dispute over wages. It had become a struggle over legitimacy. Who had the rightful claim to authority in modern America? Capital or labor? In the drawing rooms of New York and Philadelphia, industrialists watched closely. Many privately supported Henry Clay Frick's resolve. They feared that if a strong union like the Amalgamated Association prevailed, it would embolden workers elsewhere. Steel was the backbone of the nation's expansion. If steel faltered, railways slowed, bridges halted, and investors trembled. To Elliot, this was not merely a factory disagreement. It was a test of order. Newspapers reflected the division. Some editorial pages defended management's right to run its property without interference. Others criticized the severity of wage cuts and the fortress-like measures taken at the mill. Headlines used words like anarchy and tyranny in equal measure. Public perception began to fracture. For many middle-class Americans, Andrew Carnegie remained a symbol of aspiration. The immigrant who had risen through diligence and intellect. His essay, The Gospel of Wealth, still circulated widely. In it, he had argued that the wealthy were trustees of society's surplus. Philanthropy would soften inequality. Libraries would uplift the masses. Opportunity would replace resentment. But at Homestead, opportunity felt distant. The workers did not debate abstract economic theory. They debated rent, bread, and pride. Skilled laborers saw themselves not as radicals, but as craftsmen defending their place in a rapidly mechanizing world. Machines were reducing reliance on specialized skill. Managers increasingly valued output over experience. To the men inside the union, this was about identity. A proverb common among tradesmen captured their fear. When skill is cheapened, the man is cheapened. Meanwhile, in Scotland, Carnegie occupied a different world entirely. Skibo Castle offered manicured grounds and serene landscapes. He entertained guests. He discussed literature and politics. He spoke passionately about peace and international arbitration. He admired Britain's parliamentary traditions. His life now spanned continents. Yet telegrams from America disrupted that calm. Reports described mounting tension. Lockout notices. Worker assemblies. The construction of the fence. Frick's hiring of Pinkertons. Carnegie responded with measured advice. Stand firm. Avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Ensure the plant remains profitable. The distance between principle and practice widened. Among workers, a painful realization began to settle. Carnegie, who had once spoken favorably of labor's right to organize, was not intervening to protect them. Whether through agreement or acquiescence, his silence signaled alignment with management. There is a saying, in this case, absence felt like abandonment. The rivalry thus became not only economic, but symbolic. It asked a larger question about the Gilded Age. Could immense private wealth coexist with democratic ideals? America had long celebrated the self-made man. But what of the men who helped make him? The Homestead workers began to see themselves as defenders of something broader. The right to collective bargaining, the dignity of skilled labor, the possibility of shared prosperity. They organized patrols along the river. They held public meetings that drew crowds from neighboring towns. Speakers invoked the language of rights and justice. Labor creates all wealth, one union pamphlet declared, echoing a phrase often heard in 19th century activism. Frick, by contrast, saw the matter through the lens of authority. If management conceded now, future negotiations would weaken corporate control. He believed that decisive action would discourage similar challenges elsewhere. To him, the fence symbolized not aggression but protection. Thus, both sides believed they were defending order, though they defined order differently. In broader society, opinions shifted with each rumor. Some citizens feared the rise of labor radicalism, especially in the wake of anarchist movements in Europe. Others worried about the concentration of corporate power. The United States was entering an era where private fortunes rivaled public institutions in influence. Carnegie himself embodied this paradox. He funded cultural institutions, yet presided over one of the most disciplined industrial systems in the country. He praised education, yet reduced labor costs. to preserve competitiveness. He believed sincerely in moral capitalism. But morality is often tested most severely when profits narrow. A phrase often repeated in business circles warned, "Sentiment does not balance accounts." Yet in Homestead, sentiment was not easily dismissed. Families depended on those wages. Communities revolved around the mill. The fence loomed over the town like a dividing line between worlds, wealth, and labor, command and compliance. Children played in its shadow. Wives stood in doorways, watching patrols march past. The river flowed steadily, indifferent to human disputes. As June turned to July, anticipation sharpened. Rumors spread that Pinkerton agents would soon arrive. Workers vowed they would not surrender the plant quietly. Frick remained determined. Carnegie continued, corresponding from afar, and beneath the public arguments, something quieter deteriorated. For Carnegie, the conflict threatened not only profits, but reputation. His identity as a benevolent industrialist rested on the belief that capitalism could be enlightened. If violence erupted, that belief would fracture. For the workers, the struggle threatened self-respect. If they yielded without resistance, their union might dissolve entirely. The rivalry had moved beyond wages. It had become a contest over belonging in the new America, who counted and who commanded. A final proverb lingers over this moment. When pride and power collide, neither walks away unchanged. The stage was now set. The fence stood. The river waited. And the balance between admiration and resentment, between order and upheaval, trembled on the edge of dawn. By the final days of June 1892, preparation replaced negotiation entirely. Inside Fort Frick, supervisors inventoried supplies and reinforced positions. The 12-foot fence, crowned with barbed wire, stood complete. Watchmen guarded its perimeter. Within the silent mill, furnaces cooled, but authority did not. Henry Clay Frick believed he was acting with necessity. "We will hold the works," he assured associates. To him, retreat would invite chaos across the industry. There is a saying often repeated in times of confrontation: hope for peace, but prepare for war. Frick prepared. Arrangements were finalized with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. 300 armed agents would travel by barge from Pittsburgh, moving under cover of darkness along the Monongahela River. Their task was clear: secure the plant so that replacement workers could enter safely and resume production. Pinkertons had a reputation as professional strikebreakers. Their presence signaled not compromise, but force. In Homestead, word spread quickly. Workers established a vigilance committee. Patrols monitored the riverbanks day and night. Signal systems were organized: whistles, bells, and lookout posts. Men who had once discussed tonnage and shifts now discussed defensive positions. The mood was no longer merely tense, it was charged. Speakers addressed crowds with rising intensity. "We do not seek violence," union leaders insisted, "but we will defend our rights." The phrase, "an injury to one is an injury to all," echoed through gatherings, binding individual grievances into collective resolve. Wives and children sensed the change. Shops extended credit cautiously. Ministers preached sermons on justice and restraint. Some urged calm, quoting scripture. "Blessed are the peacemakers," others warned that dignity sometimes required resistance. His telegrams encouraged firmness but cautioned against bloodshed. He trusted Frick's judgment. Whether from confidence or convenience, he did not intervene decisively. Distance can soften the edges of reality. At Skybow Castle, the lawns were quiet. The air carried no smoke from cooling furnaces. Yet each telegram carried a rising undertone, the sense that events were slipping beyond calculation. On the 4th of July, Independence Day, the town marked the nation's founding with muted celebration. Fireworks burst faintly over rooftops. Speeches referenced liberty and rights. The irony was not lost on those standing outside locked factory gates. By the 5th of July, lookouts along the river reported unusual movement. Barges were said to be preparing departure. Workers doubled patrols. Fires burned through the night as men remained alert. A proverb whispered among older laborers captured the atmosphere. When the river grows quiet, expect a storm. Before dawn on the 6th of July, the river would indeed bring something irreversible. The stage was no longer theoretical. It was physical wood, wire, rifles, resolve, and as history often proves, once plans are set in motion, even those who design them cannot fully control their outcome. At around 4 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of July, 1892, the river delivered its answer. Two barges drifted slowly toward the Homestead works, dark against the pale light of dawn. On board were roughly 300 Pinkerton agents, armed with rifles and revolvers. Their orders were simple: land secure the mill and prepare it for non-union labor. But the river was not empty. Lookouts spotted the movement almost immediately. A whistle pierced the quiet. Then another. Within minutes, workers and townspeople gathered along the riverbank. Some carried rifles, others held pistols, sticks, or stones. Many carried nothing but determination. The barges attempted to dock. Shouts erupted from both sides. Each accused the other of firing first. The truth blurred in the chaos. A single shot cracked through the air. Then another. Within seconds, gunfire exploded across the water. What followed was not a battle of armies, but something more volatile. Armed civilians facing hired guards in the half-light of morning. Bullets struck wood and flesh alike. Smoke drifted over the river. Men fell on both sides. There is a grim saying: once the first shot is fired, reason retreats. On that morning, reason vanished entirely. Workers used whatever cover they could find. Piles of steel, riverbank embankments. Pinkertons fired from within the barges, attempting to push forward. Attempts were made to set the barges alight. Cannon were reportedly brought from a local arsenal. The confrontation stretched hour after hour beneath the rising sun. By mid-morning, the town had transformed into a battlefield. Women carried water and supplies to the strikers. Some tended the wounded. Others shouted encouragement. Children watched from doorways, absorbing a lesson they would never forget. Inside the barges, Pinkertons found themselves trapped. They had expected to secure the plant quickly. Instead, they were pinned between river and resistance. Heat intensified. Ammunition dwindled. Negotiations began intermittently, then collapsed again amid sporadic gunfire. By early afternoon, the situation had become unsustainable. The Pinkertons agreed to surrender on the condition of safe passage. Oh, but surrender did not end anger. As the Pinkertons disembarked, exhausted and wounded, crowds surrounded them. Some townspeople struck or jeered. They captured men despite Union leaders' attempts to maintain order. Violence flared briefly before stabilizing. The Pinkertons were eventually escorted away by rail. When silence finally settled over Homestead, the toll was heavy. At least 9 workers were dead. 7 Pinkertons had been killed. Dozens more lay wounded. The furnaces remained cold. Across the nation, headlines blazed. Some papers portrayed the workers as defenders of their homes. Others condemned them as rioters who had defied lawful authority. The language hardened quickly. Insurrection. Lawlessness. Industrial war. A proverb often quoted in the aftermath of tragedy surfaced. Victory purchased with blood is seldom clean. Though the workers had forced the Pinkertons to retreat, the moral clarity of their cause grew more complicated in the eyes of the public. In Scotland, Andrew Carnegie read the news with alarm. The clash had escalated beyond negotiation. The conflict he had hoped would remain contained had erupted into national spectacle. The point of no return had arrived. Gunfire along the Monongahela had transformed a labor dispute into a symbol. The question was no longer whether the Union would negotiate. It was whether America would tolerate armed resistance within its industrial heart. And history, once stirred by violence, rarely returns quietly to balance. The smoke cleared from the riverbank, but the conflict did not end. Within days of the confrontation, the governor of Pennsylvania, Robert Pattison, authorized the deployment of nearly 8,000 state militia to Homestead. Their arrival was disciplined and overwhelming. Trains rolled in carrying uniformed soldiers with fixed bayonets. Order, in the language of the state, had returned. The mills reopened under military protection. Where Pinkertons had failed to secure entry, the state succeeded. Replacement workers, many of them immigrants, unfamiliar with the union's struggle, were escorted through guarded gates. Production resumed gradually. The furnaces, once silent, roared again. For the strikers, the presence of the militia signaled a sobering reality. Corporate power could summon public force, a bitter proverb circulated among labor circles. When money speaks, the law listens. Whether entirely fair or not, it captured the mood of defeat. The union's leverage weakened daily. With the plant operating and wages withheld, families felt mounting pressure. Savings dwindled. Credit tightened. Pride collided with hunger. Then, on the 23rd of July, 1892, an event occurred that shifted public sentiment dramatically. Alexander Bettman, a young anarchist, unaffiliated formally with the Union, entered Henry Clay Frick's Pittsburgh office, armed with a revolver and a sharpened file. He shot Frick twice and stabbed him before being restrained. Miraculously, Frick survived. The attempted assassination altered the narrative almost overnight. Newspapers that had once expressed sympathy for workers now emphasized the threat of radicalism. The word anarchy loomed large in headlines. Though union leaders condemned the attack immediately, public opinion grew wary of the entire movement. There is an old warning. One reckless act can undo 1,000 careful words. In this case, Berkman's violence undermined months of organized protest. The strike became entangled with fears of social unrest and foreign ideologies. Frick, recovering from his wounds, returned defiantly to work. His resolve hardened. Negotiation no longer seemed possible. To him, survival itself justified severity. Andrew Carnegie, still in Scotland, faced a reputational crisis. His earlier writings on harmony between labor and capital were now contrasted with images of bloodshed and troops. Critics accused him of orchestrating events from afar. Supporters argued he could not have foreseen such escalation. He wrote privately of his regret that violence had occurred. Publicly, however, he did not repudiate Frick's strategy. The mills continued operating without union recognition. By autumn, the strike was effectively broken. Union membership at Homestead collapsed. Blacklists reportedly prevented many former workers from returning under new management. Skilled labor lost bargaining power. The Amalgamated Association, once a formidable presence in steel, entered a long decline. The long-term consequences reached beyond one town. The Homestead Strike signaled a turning point in American industrial relations. Heavy industry would remain largely non-union for decades. Corporate consolidation accelerated. Efficiency triumphed over negotiation. A saying often quoted in the aftermath captured the grim lesson. Steel is forged in fire, but men are broken in it. For the families of the dead, ideology mattered little. Funerals were held quietly. Wives faced uncertain futures. Children grew up with stories of courage and loss intertwined. The mills continued to glow at night, indifferent to memory. Carnegie's image split into two irreconcilable halves. On one side stood the philanthropist, the advocate of libraries, education, and peace. On the other stood the industrialist whose company had broken a union through lockout, force, and state intervention. The point of no return had not been merely the first shot on the river. It had been the decision to defend authority at all costs, even if that cost included blood and broken trust. In later years, some would argue that industrial stability required firm action. Others would insist that a chance for cooperative reform had been lost forever. The debate echoed through subsequent decades, influencing labor movements, political reforms, and public attitudes toward wealth. A final proverb lingers over the aftermath. What is won by strength may be kept by strength, but rarely by affection. Carnegie Steel survived. It prospered. Within a decade, it would be sold to J.P. Morgan and folded into U.S. Steel, creating the world's first billion-dollar corporation. But something intangible had been altered. In Homestead, the furnaces burned again. The rail lines extended. The nation continued building upward and outward. Yet beneath the steel and smoke, a fracture remained between admiration for ambition and suspicion of its cost. Power had prevailed. Whether it had persuaded was another matter entirely. In the years following Homestead, Andrew Carnegie rarely spoke of the strike in public detail. The furnaces had resumed their rhythm. Profits recovered. Markets stabilized. Outwardly, the empire remained strong. Yet reputation, once fractured, does not mend as cleanly as steel. Carnegie continued writing and speaking about peace, arbitration, and philanthropy. He believed deeply that wealth carried obligation. Surplus wealth, he insisted, is a sacred trust. His language remained moral, almost spiritual in tone. To him, industry was a tool. Its true purpose lay in elevation of society, but Homestead lingered like a shadow. Privately, correspondence reveals that Carnegie was troubled by the violence. He had hoped firmness would resolve matters without bloodshed. Instead, his absence had allowed Henry Clay Frick to act decisively and ruthlessly. Their partnership, once purely strategic, cooled after the strike. Though both men remained committed to business efficiency, personal warmth diminished. There is a proverb that says, "Even iron rusts when left unattended." The relationship between Carnegie and Frick, once strong in mutual ambition, began to corrode. Meanwhile, Carnegie turned increasingly toward his larger ambition, to leave industry entirely and dedicate himself to philanthropy. By the late 1890s, consolidation swept through American business. Financier J.P. Morgan sought to merge major steel operations into a single entity capable of dominating global markets. Negotiations began quietly. In 1901, Carnegie agreed to sell his steel company to Morgan for approximately $480 million, an astronomical sum at the time. The deal created the United States Steel Corporation, the first corporation in the world valued at over $1 billion. Carnegie, at 65, became one of the richest men in history. A saying common among industrial magnates captured the moment: "No one to leave the furnace." Carnegie believed he had done precisely that. He had built, consolidated, and now exited at the height of influence. Yet departure did not erase memory. Critics continued to reference Homestead when evaluating his moral philosophy. Supporters countered that no industrial transformation occurs without conflict. Carnegie himself maintained that concentrated wealth, if distributed wisely, justified its accumulation. He increased his philanthropic commitments, dramatically funding universities, scientific research, peace initiatives, and thousands of public libraries. To some, this was redemption. To others, it was contradiction. The final battles were not fought with rifles, but with narrative. How would history remember him? As benefactor or breaker of unions? As enlightened capitalist or architect of industrial discipline? In truth, both images coexisted. There is an old reflection: a man may escape his enemies, but not his legacy. Carnegie could not rewrite Homestead. He could only build beyond it. And so he chose to build, not with steel, but with stone and scholarship. Whether that choice balanced the scales remained a question history would debate long after the furnaces cooled. If steel had built his fortune, stone and knowledge would shape his immortality. After the sale of Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901, Andrew Carnegie entered what he called the distribution phase of his life. He had long argued that vast wealth should not be passed intact to heirs, nor hoarded in vaults. It should be returned to society in ways that encourage self-improvement. The man who dies thus, rich dies disgraced. He had written in 1889, and now he intended to avoid disgrace. The scale of his philanthropy was extraordinary. He funded the construction of more than 2,500 public libraries across the English-speaking world and beyond in Britain, America, Canada, Australia, even parts of the Caribbean. Each building bore his name. Each required the local community to provide land and ongoing maintenance, ensuring shared responsibility. Carnegie believed libraries had transformed his own life. As a boy in Allegheny, he had borrowed books from Colonel James Anderson's private collection. Those volumes opened intellectual doors beyond factory walls. In giving libraries, he sought to replicate that opportunity. There is a proverb often associated with education: give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Teach him to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. Carnegie embraced this principle. Charity that relieved immediate suffering, he argued, could create dependency. Institutions that fostered learning created independence. Beyond libraries, he funded Carnegie Hall in New York, a temple of music, that hosted the world's finest performers. He endowed the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington, supporting research and discovery. He established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, convinced that arbitration could prevent wars between nations. In public ceremonies, speeches praised his generosity. Newspapers hailed him as a model of enlightened wealth. School children walked up marble steps into buildings inscribed with his name. In towns where factories once dominated, quiet reading rooms stood as symbols of aspiration. Yet monuments cannot silence memory. In industrial regions, especially near Pittsburgh, the story of Homestead persisted. Workers remembered the fence. Families remembered funerals. Union leaders referenced the strike in speeches for years afterward. For them, Carnegie's libraries did not erase the image of locked gates. A saying whispered in labor circles captured the tension. You cannot build a library over a wound and call it healed. Carnegie, however, saw his philanthropy as moral continuity rather than contradiction. He argued that wealth creation and wealth distribution were separate phases of one responsibility. Industry required discipline. Philanthropy required generosity. To him, both served progress. In his later writings, he spoke frequently of peace. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 distressed him deeply. He had hoped that arbitration and diplomacy might replace armed conflict. His fortune funded organizations dedicated to international dialogue, yet Europe descended into violence regardless. It was a bitter irony. The man who had presided over industrial conflict now watched nations tear themselves apart on a far larger scale. He urged leaders to pursue negotiation. He lamented the loss of life, but events moved beyond individual influence. Privately, Carnegie lived comfortably between America and Scotland. Skibo Castle remained a retreat. He enjoyed correspondence with intellectuals and statesmen. He maintained an image of genial elder statesman, reflecting on a century transformed by industry, yet the duality of his legacy deepened. On one side stood the philanthropist who gave away the vast majority of his fortune, over $350 million in his lifetime. On the other stood the industrialist whose company had crushed one of the most significant labor strikes of the 19th century. History often simplifies figures into heroes or villains. Carnegie resisted such simplicity. He died in 1919 at the age of 83. By then, his name adorned institutions worldwide. Children learned in buildings funded by his wealth. Scientists conducted research under foundations he had established. Musicians performed beneath the arches of halls he had endowed. But in Homestead, the mill still stood. The town would later erect memorials to the strikers who had fallen in 1892. Their names, too, were carved in stone. Steel rails carried trains across the continent. Libraries offered quiet refuge from noise. Both legacies endured, one forged in fire, the other in philanthropy. There is an old reflection. Stone remembers what men prefer to forget. Carnegie's stone buildings told one story of opportunity and uplift. The steel mills told another of discipline and power. Between them lay the truth of his life, ambition tempered by belief, generosity shadowed by severity. Monuments may rise higher than factories, but they cannot entirely replace them. The name Carnegie became synonymous with giving. Yet for those who traced history through labor struggles, it also symbolized a decisive moment when capital asserted dominance, and so his enduring moment was not singular. It was divided as the nation had been divided between admiration and doubt. When Andrew Carnegie died in August 1919, the age he had helped shape was already changing. The United States Steel Corporation, formed from his former empire, remained powerful, yet it no longer carried his personal imprint. Ownership had shifted from the singular will of a founder to the diffuse authority of shareholders and directors. The era of individual industrial titans was gradually giving way to corporate bureaucracy. There is a proverb that says, "Empires built by one hand are seldom ruled by one forever." Carnegie had understood this when he chose to sell. He left at the height of influence, believing he had mastered timing, but no fortune escapes transformation. In the years following his death, labor movements regained strength. The New Deal reforms of the 1930s would re-legitimize unions in heavy industry. Collective bargaining returned to steel mills that had once expelled it. The memory of Homestead, long dormant in some circles, resurfaced as a lesson in what unchecked authority could produce. The balance between capital and labor shifted again, not entirely, not permanently, but noticeably, Carnegie's philanthropic institutions endured more steadily than his industrial dominance. Libraries remained open. Foundations continued awarding grants. Carnegie Hall hosted musicians across generations. His name, etched in stone, proved more durable than any single corporate structure. Yet even monuments require maintenance. Historians began re-examining the Gilded Age with sharper scrutiny. They debated whether men like Carnegie were architects of progress or beneficiaries of inequality. Some praised his upward mobility and generosity. Others criticized the harsh conditions within his mills. The Homestead Strike remained central to these discussions. A saying often repeated in reflection applies well here. Time does not erase, it clarifies. With distance, the contradictions of his life became clearer rather than softer. The town of Homestead itself changed. The once dominant steelworks eventually declined in the 20th century as global competition intensified. Portions of the site were demolished or repurposed. Where furnaces once glowed, commercial developments later rose. The industrial landscape that had defined identity for generations faded. And so, in a quiet irony, the mills that had sparked such conflict did not outlive the century intact. Carnegie's personal legacy survived through adaptation. His fortune had been largely distributed before his death, following his conviction that wealth should circulate rather than stagnate. Unlike many dynasties, there was no vast hereditary empire bearing his direct control. His daughter inherited comfort, but not industrial command. In T-Sensei, he escaped one common fate of old money stagnation through lineage. His influence passed into institutions rather than bloodlines. Yet moral judgment is rarely settled so cleanly. To some, Carnegie proved that capitalism could generate both wealth and public benefit. To others, he illustrated the peril of concentrating power in private hands. The Homestead Strike remained a cautionary tale of what occurs when dialogue collapses and authority relies on force. A final proverb lingers at the edge of his story. Every fortune leaves a footprint. Carnegie's footprint is double. One impression rests in quiet reading rooms where children turn pages beneath carved stone arches. The other lies along a riverbank where workers once stood, rifles in trembling hands, defending what they believed was theirs. Botari rail. Bot endure. Andrew Carnegie gained power through discipline, foresight, and relentless belief in progress. He rose from poverty in Scotland to command the steel that built modern America. Railways stretched westward. Bridges arched across rivers. Cities climbed higher because steel was strong and because he had mastered it. He won industrial dominance. He won wealth beyond imagination. And in the final chapters of his life, he gave much of it away, building libraries and institutions that still serve millions. Yet what was gained did not come without loss. At Homestead, trust fractured between labor and capital. Workers who once believed in shared progress felt excluded from it. Blood on the riverbank stained the narrative of harmony he had hoped to champion. The point of no return was not merely the gunfire. It was the decision that authority must prevail, even if dignity suffered. There's an old reflection. You may build with one hand and break with the other. Carnegie built opportunity through philanthropy, yet his empire broke a union in pursuit of efficiency. Both truths coexist. What endured? His name in stone. His libraries. His belief that wealth carried responsibility. What was permanently lost? The possibility that his industrial might could have evolved without confrontation, that partnership might have replaced siege. History rarely offers pure victories. In Carnegie's case, steel and stone stand side by side as testimony. One forged in fire, the other carved in generosity. And between them lies the lesson of his life. Power can build nations, but it always leaves a mark.